Hi, I'm Jess, part-time hobbit, and I'm here to talk to you about Tolkien. If you know Lord of the Rings for one thing, it's probably its world building, and one of my personal favorite parts of that world building are the animals that populate Middle-earth. This video is a bit of a spiritual sequel to the one I did on dragons a couple months ago, and I cannot wait to get into the fauna of Middle-earth and the way that Tolkien used it to shape his world. We are going to begin this journey in an unexpected place with cats. Cats don't play a significant role in the completed, published versions of Tolkien's text, but I think that makes them the perfect starting point. Understanding why Tolkien cut cats out of his world allows us to better understand why he kept things in. The most important cat in Tolkien's legendarium comes from the Tale of Tinuviel. This is one of the earliest extant examples of Tolkien's work in Middle-earth, and was written as part of the Book of Lost Tales back in 1917. The Tale of Tinuviel would later be developed into the Lay of Luthien, or as it is known in the Silmarillion, the Tale of Beren and Luthien. This early draft is fairly different from what we end up seeing in the Silmarillion, including, and not limited to, Beren being a gnome.
I'm a gnome, and you've been gnomed!
Of course, Tolkien didn't mean like a garden gnome, but I do think it's funnier if we ignore that, so for the rest of this story, I will be referring to Beren as an actual garden gnome. If you aren't familiar with the tale, Luthien was a beautiful elvish princess, and Beren was apparently the gnome who fell in love with her. In order to win her hand in marriage, Beren has to go on a quest to find a Silmaril, one of the most sought-after artifacts in Middle-earth. In the first draft of this epic poem, the first foe that Beren and Luthien face is Tevildo, Prince of Cats, who, you guessed it, is a cat. Tevildo is a large black cat with two different colored eyes and an evil golden collar. It's unspecified whether Tevildo himself is evil, or if the golden collar is evil, or if he's under the influence of some kind of a spell. Either way, he has a whole castle up on a hill to himself filled with his cat bros, who, just like Tevildo, are also giant and can talk. Tevildo and his cats are servants of the Dark Lord, tasked with filling his table with meat. Beren is captured pretty much immediately by Morgoth after leaving for his quest, and he is given to Tevildo as a kitchen servant. Tevildo hates him right off the bat because he can smell that Beren is more of a dog guy than a cat guy, which is apparently a deal breaker. And so Tevildo gives him a nasty little challenge. He challenges Beren to catch 3 mice in 3 days. However, these aren't just any mice. Tevildo has created a brood of super mice that are the size of rats. Considering that he is a gnome and not a giant cat, Beren fails at this task, and he is so distraught with himself that he wishes that he had never even met Luthien at all. And you know, that feels a little dramatic to me, but in his defense, I have never been a gnome chasing giant mice for 3 days, so maybe I shouldn't judge. Beren is forced into the role of kitchen wench, and he spirals into a deep depression, constantly overworked and covered in grime. Meanwhile, Luthien has busted herself out of her father's imprisonment and found her own comically large animal, a wolfhound named Huan. Obviously, Huan and Tevildo have beef, because, you know, the whole dog-cat thing, and so Huan helps Luthien devise a plan to break Beren out. Luthien allows herself to be captured by Tevildo, and once inside the castle, she tells him about Huan, who is apparently lying sick and weak in the forest. Tevildo hates Huan enough to take this bait, and so he goes out into the woods to try and kill him in his weakened state. Of course, as soon as Tevildo arrives, Huan reveals that this was a trap, and they fight, leaving Huan injured but victorious, and leaving Tevildo trapped up a tree. Huan holds Tevildo hostage until he gives his golden collar over to Luthien, as well as the spell that will undo the magic that he has cast on his cat buds. She goes back to the castle, undoes the spell, and they all turn back into normal cats. They never say what happened to the super mice, so I guess, like, canonically, those could still just be out there. Tevildo and co are banished by Morgoth and live out the rest of their days in exile, sad and angry. The other appearance of cats in the Legendarium is not a lot more optimistic than this. Beruthiel was a queen of Gondor in the early Third Age, and although she's only briefly mentioned, her story is fascinating. She seemed pretty miserable overall. She hated all colors except black, parties, the sea, and cats. In regards to that last detail, Tolkien said that her hatred of cats only drew them closer to her. She decided to take advantage of that and tortured a group of 10 cats until they were willing to do her bidding. They acted as her eyes throughout the kingdom, and everyone in Gondor was absolutely terrified of crossing their paths. Due to Beruthiel's overall, bad vibes, she was eventually struck from the history books entirely. And if you'll remember, she hated the ocean, which is why they placed her and her cats on a boat and sent her out to sea, doomed to sail together forever. I mean, talk about a crazy cat lady, am I right? So yeah, I don't think Tolkien liked cats. And I think a lot of this stemmed from a lack of understanding of cats and their role in the storytelling culture of the world. A theme we will keep coming back to throughout this video is the mythic roots of animals. This was incredibly important to Tolkien and the way that he integrated animals into his storytelling worlds. For example, one of his main gripes with C.S. Lewis's Narnia was that Mr. Tumnus, the kindly guide to the child protagonists, was meant to be a faun or satyr. Side note, fauns and satyrs were different from each other, but they kinda melded into one in the Renaissance period, so I'm gonna talk about them like they're one thing. Sorry, Greek mythology buffs. Satyrs, according to most pre-Narnia myths and stories, were not stand-up guys. They loved copious amounts of alcohol and insane parties, and, well, I can't put any art of them up on screen without copiously blurring things. Needless to say, a satyr as the friendly guide to four, sober, innocent children just really didn't make sense considering their mythological precedents. And for Tolkien, this was a deal breaker. For him, a creature, real or mythological, could not be separated from its context within all of storytelling tradition. So back to cats, they have somewhat ambiguous mythic origins. The first record we have of cats appearing in myth was in ancient Egypt, where they were widely adored as symbols of fertility, power, and justice. However, while Tolkien would have been aware of this, he was much more concerned with European mythic tradition, which didn't see cats in such a positive light. Cats were thought to be the familiars of witches and agents of the dark arts. Clearly, this was very influential on his portrayal of cats, where they weren't inherently evil, but they were very convenient tools for the dark arts. So although he didn't make them fundamentally cruel, I don't think he was a very big fan of them. In fact, in one of his letters, he admits that he thinks cats would be the fauna of Mordor, which I think is a fun title. However, most people don't view cats as purveyors of evil these days, and while I'm sure Tolkien wasn't overly worried about offending the cat lovers of the world, I think that it did have an influence on him cutting them out of his story entirely. While Beruthiel and her feline spies remain as a pretty brief footnote, Tevildo was turned into Sauron. Yeah, the big spiky dude. He kind of started out as a cat, which is pretty funny to me. More importantly though, the cat imagery in Beren and Luthien was swapped out for dogs and wolves, which conveniently enough, we will be talking about next. For Tolkien, dogs and wolves seem kind of interchangeable, especially because the one dog that he wrote about was a wolfhound, but that dog is still an excellent example of his view of the capacity for good in the species. Huan was a wolfhound who was gifted to the elf Celegorm by the hunter god Orome. Because he was literally from heaven, Huan was given some special traits, such as being the size of a small horse and never needing to sleep. It was prophesied that he would only be able to be killed by the greatest wolf that ever lived. Though he was fiercely loyal to Celegorm, Huan was swayed by Luthien's plight, and eventually betrayed his master to look after her and Beren. He amassed quite the kill count, slaughtering almost all of Sauron's trained wolves, and he even fought and killed Draugluin. Draugluin was known as the father of wolves and werewolves, who guarded the gates of Tol in Garroth. After Huan killed Draugluin, Sauron himself went out in the form of a wolf to face off against Huan. Though he was the fiercest opponent Huan had ever faced, Huan prevailed, and Sauron was forced to flee. In his resentment, Sauron took one of Draugluin's pups and raised him by hand, feeding him living flesh until he was strong enough to be known as Carcharoth, or the Red Maw. This was the greatest wolf to ever live, the predestined foe of Huan, and he sat biding his time, guarding the gates of Angband. Huan helped Beren and Luthien sneak through those very gates. He gave them the skin of Draugluin and a different vampire lady, don't ask, which allowed them to transform into those creatures and fly by unnoticed. This worked like a charm, allowing them to sneak in and steal a Silmaril from Morgoth himself, but they forgot to put the disguises back on their way out. Carcharoth managed to bite off Beren's hand, swallowing both it and the Silmaril that he had been holding. Beren and Luthien barely escaped empty-handed. Well, one-handed, I guess. Carcharoth was driven utterly mad by the Silmaril in his stomach, which burned him from the inside out with the pureness of its light. Huan lent Beren a hand, hunting Carcharoth down and engaging in battle. As the prophecy foretold, Huan was killed, but he managed to take Carcharoth down with him. Loyal and loving to the end, Huan used his last breath to bid farewell to Beren and Luthien. Tolkien's thoughts on dogs and wolves seem fairly obvious to me. They exist as opposite sides to the same coin. Huan is the perfect example of what a dog could be when it is raised with care and goodness. He is brave, loyal, and caring even to the end. Meanwhile, Carcharoth is raised on blood and hatred. And in the pursuit of power, he is driven mad and killed by lightness itself. This matches well with the mythic backdrop of dogs and wolves. Throughout storytelling tradition, wolves have been both good and evil. The Judeo-Christian Bible continually uses them as a sign of evil, the natural enemy to the flock of the church. However, in Rome, wolves were revered for their loyalty and bravery. The founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus, were raised by a she-wolf, even drinking her milk when they were young. Norse mythology, which was of particular interest to Tolkien, saw wolves as both positive and negative. They were simultaneously agents of chaos and destruction and symbols of loyalty and protection. I think that Tolkien had a very comfortable grasp on wolves as this kind of dual-natured force, and thus was able to easily integrate them into his legendarium. The term werewolf is also regularly used in the tale of Beren and Luthien, notably when both Sauron and Beren take on the form of wolves. However, he's definitely not talking about oh god, the full moon! My transformation begins! Awoo! Types of werewolves that we're used to in modern media. The tradition of werewolves goes all the way back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, the first story, as well as ancient Greek myth, where people were turned into wolves as a punishment. However, Norse mythology took a different approach. In the Norse Volsunga saga, a father and son put on wolf skins, which allows them to take on the form of wolves. As wolves, they go on a horrifically murderous rampage and end up fighting with each other. Tolkien was a big Volsunga saga guy, and so he leaned towards this tradition. This leads us so neatly into our next topic, Beorn the Skin Changer. It's almost like I planned that. I did. Yeah, I did plan that. Beorn is Tolkien's take on the Skin Changer, also known as the Berserker myth. Berserkers were a European, particularly Norse idea, and they were a group of elite soldiers who would put on animal skins and, typically through the intercession of a god, transform into these animals on the battlefield. They would usually choose to become wolves or bears, just depending on their cultural and personal affinity towards these animals and the symbols associated with them. Whether or not they actually turned into these animals is pretty irrelevant, because on the battlefield, they were just as fierce as them. It's said that if they were forced to wait for a battle, a group of berserkers would start gnawing on their own wooden shields, starting fistfights with trees, and even start killing each other in their frenzied state. Berserker abilities were allegedly passed down genetically from father to son, and however historically legitimate they were, they truly made their mark on European and Norse battle stories. And Beorn is Tolkien's take on this berserker tradition. Beorn was a wild man of the Third Age who was able to fully transform into a bear at will. Beorn is the only of his kind that we meet, but we are led to believe that skin changing is an inherited trait for him and all of his kin. Though he is capable of entering a fierce rage, Beorn is characterized by his kindness and hospitality, especially when he takes in Gandalf and Thorin Oakenshield's company during the events of The Hobbit. He houses them and feeds them with the bread that he has baked and the honey and milk that he has gotten from the bees and animals that he tends to. Beorn is the epitome of the gentle giant, one who seeks out peace and gentleness, but can be driven to violence when that peace is disturbed. Now, bear with me. But I think there's much more to this character than meets the eye. I'm sorry. Beyond these initial facts that we know, Beorn is quite mysterious. Though we catch some whisperings of his origins, this is one of the very rare things in Tolkien's legendarium that is not very deeply explored or explained. In a way, I see Beorn as a precursor to Tom Bombadil. Though there were versions of Tom Bombadil's character written, I believe, before The Hobbit was written, Beorn predates him within Middle-earth itself, and in Beorn we see him kind of trying out the ideas that he would later cement in Tom Bombadil. Tom Bombadil remains as like a whole nother question of his own. But I believe that Beorn can be interpreted as a representation of nature itself. It is both protective and dangerous, wise and incomprehensible, familiar and yet entirely unknown. As both a plot device and a character, Beorn enriches Middle-earth by giving us a tantalizing hint of all that is unknown. Speaking of plot devices, Tolkien's birds are an excellent example. That segue was a bit of a stretch, but yeah, you know, you can't win them all. The Crabine are never given characters or personalities, but they exist as a tool within Tolkien's world. They're more or less hyper-intelligent crows that Saruman uses to spy on Middle-earth. Crows and birds in general are traditionally omens of ill, especially in the way that Tolkien wields them as dark, cloud-like formations that wisp across the sky. They are both a device to move the plot forward and instill dread wherever they pass. The thrushes of Erebor also have important symbolic value. They were once messengers of Dale, but once Dale was destroyed, they remained, ready to guide Thorin and his company to the secret doors of Erebor with their insistent knocking. I am unaware of any specific traditions based around thrushes, so as always, please let me know if you guys have any thoughts on that matter. Now it's time to talk about the big guys, and that is the eagles. Tolkien's eagles are like literally big, but they're also the most important birds in the legendarium. From the very beginning, the eagles are the messengers of Manwë. Manwë is the big daddy of Valar, the ruler of air and sky, and a pretty cool guy. Because of this, the eagles were also important, and tended to play pretty significant historical roles. Thorondor was probably the most important, and he was known as the father of eagles. Thorondor was said to have a wingspan of 180 feet, or over 50 meters, or like half the length of an American football field, I think. And he showed up a lot in the First Age. He may have even fought against Ancalagon the Black, the largest dragon in history during the War of Wrath. And though his fate may be lost to time, Thorondor fathered the great eagles that would continue to guard Middle-earth through to the Third Age. Storytelling tradition is actually no stranger to really big eagles. In the Homeric Hymn to Aphrodite, written approximately in the 7th century BCE, the intrepid hero Ganymede is rescued by a giant eagle. However, Tolkien likely took the most of his eagle inspiration from one of his favorites, the medieval poet Chaucer. One of Chaucer's early works, The House of Fame, involves his naive, unsure hero being rescued by a massive eagle who points out the hero's deficiencies as he flies him to safety. This is clearly paralleled by Bilbo's rescue in The Hobbit, when he and the dwarves are scooped into safety, all while an eagle points out Bilbo's obvious fear. Both Chaucer and Tolkien use the eagles for a dual purpose, as a convenient rescue, and to point out their heroes' inadequacies. Keeping this in mind, we are able to determine a little bit more about the eagle's purpose. The eagles are often referred to Tolkien's version of divine intervention, or deus ex machina. Deus ex machina means God out of the machine, and fun fact, it actually comes from ancient Greek theater. In ancient Greek theater, there would literally be machines such as cranes or raised platforms that would make the actors appear as gods. These characters were used to easily resolve conflicts in the final moments of the play, hence the term god out of machine being used to indicate a plot device that kind of wraps up the story in the third act, even if it's a little bit too good to be true. That was definitely an irrelevant aside, but hey, I gotta use my theater degree somehow. So while the eagles were like kind of deus ex machina, Tolkien uses them for much more than just that. Especially in The Hobbit, the eagles are used as a hurdle for the protagonist. By helping Bilbo out, they rob him of the chance to prove himself strong and competent, which I would argue is the entire point of his character arc. But in order to achieve this goal, Bilbo has to fight not only against his own nature, but against nature itself. And this brings us to the age-old question, say it with me, why didn't they fly the eagles to Mordor? And there are literally thousands of answers to that question, but right here, it's because that's not the point of the story. Frodo and Sam didn't reach Mount Doom and save the world because of the eagles, but in spite of them. They didn't choose the easy path or the safe path, they chose the path that would forge them into stronger people. In Greek and Roman myth, eagles acted as the messengers of Zeus or Jupiter, something that Tolkien clearly references in his eagles and their relationship to the Valar Manwë. Eagles are traditionally the voice of God, and it makes sense that Tolkien would utilize this voice of God to push these characters into the path that they're meant to follow. Eagles are also supposedly wise and noble, an association that Tolkien used to build implicit trust in them as saviors. I mean, if a 100-foot eagle was like coming at me, I would definitely run. Maybe a positive predisposition towards these freaky guys makes them seem more trustworthy instead of absolutely terrifying. To Tolkien, eagles were a tool expertly wielded to help reveal the mettle of his protagonists. While Tolkien seems to have somewhat of an affection for all of the creatures that I've talked about, I think this next one was his favorite. And listen, I hate to say this, but I think Tolkien was a horse girl at heart. In the earlier Legendarium, horses are kind of just used as a plot device, but in The Lord of the Rings, we see Tolkien's love for horses start to shine through. Bill the Pony is a lovely example. He's just a small town horse, living in a lonely world. The Fellowship purchases him for far too much money, they note, in Bree, and he starts out very sickly. However, when they reach Rivendell, Bill the Pony is healed by its magic and presses forward loyally all the way to the gates of Moria. Unfortunately, it is there that he spooks and flees, but he does manage to make his way safely back to Bree. Tolkien, of course, brings him back up in the Battle of Bywater, where he gets a good kick in at his old cruel master, and manages to help the hobbits save the Shire. The counterpoint to Bill's shabby horse energy is the chicest of them all, Shadowfax, the Lord of Horses. Shadowfax is basically like a horse god descended from the Meras, who in turn may have been raised by Orome, the Hunter Valar. But instead of giving Shadowfax extra special powers, Tolkien uses this opportunity to just make him extra horsey. Shadowfax can't talk or fly or spit flames, but he is fast, loyal, and tireless. He is the quintessential and ultimate horse. Bill the Pony and Shadowfax alike are praised both in Middle-earth and by the fandom just for being really great horses. And for Tolkien, being a good horse was enough. He needed no extra bells and whistles. He was happy for them to be exemplary in what they were meant to be. And according to his daughter, Tolkien had learned to ride horses as part of his basic training and loved them quite a bit. Horses in Middle-earth represent an untarnishable purity. They are good because they are what they are meant to be. Now, spiders? Crazy theory time. But I don't think Tolkien liked them much. Ungoliant is the first spider that we meet in the Legendarium. She is the personification of evil and has no known origin, even to the Valar, who participated in the creation of time and space. She lusted so greatly for power and light that she was immune even to the tempting of Morgoth, who was only able to temporarily sway her to his ways. The Silmarillion writes that she hungered for light, and hated it. Ungoliant is the personification of self-destructive hunger, the kind that could never be satiated even once the sun and the moon were devoured. Shelob was the last and greatest of Ungoliant's foul spawn, and she existed until the Third Age, where she endangers Frodo and Sam on their way to Mordor. She is kind of just Ungoliant light, but she still embodies this hollow, self-destructive lust. And although it may not have been their, true form in the spiritual sense, they both chose to appear as spiders. I find this fascinating because there really isn't much precedence for this in story or myth. Spider myths are actually quite positive overall, with spiders and their affinity for weaving seen as constructive rather than destructive. They are creators, and although sometimes they may be cast in the trickster role, they certainly aren't this primal, undefeated evil that Tolkien makes them out to be. I can only imagine that this comes from his own personal bias of arachnophobia, though he never stated that outright. In his biography of Tolkien, Humphrey Carpenter writes, "He stumbled on a tarantula. It bit him and he ran in terror across the garden until the nurse snatched him up and sucked out the poison." By the way, don't do that. That's not what you should do. When he grew up, he could remember a hot day and running in fear through the long, dead grass, but the memory of the tarantula itself faded, and he said that the incident left him with no especial dislike of spiders. Nevertheless, in his stories, he wrote more than once of monstrous spiders with venomous bites. So I guess Carpenter kinda said it best. Tolkien denies any personal connection, and we can't prove it definitively. But you don't exactly go around making your favorite animal in the world the primal embodiment of evil. Overall, Tolkien is just a master at this stuff. Lately, and more so than usual, I've been thinking about stories. The way that they all weave in and out of each other, borrowing threads and changing hands, forming this gorgeous tapestry of myth, legend, and history that we get to look back on. And Tolkien knew just how to tuck himself into the midst of those threads, taking something old and transforming it into something entirely new. His animals are a beautiful example of this art in action. They sit at the crossroads of reality and myth and remind us what good storytelling is all about. This brings us to the end of our little traipse through the fauna of Middle-earth. There's obviously a lot I didn't cover and stuff that I will cover, especially in terms of monsters and the like, but if you do have a hankering for monsters, check out the one I did on dragons a couple months ago, because it's a ton of fun. If you're intrigued by some of the arguments that I touched on, especially concerning Beorn and the eagles, in the description I'm going to cite the original, much more thorough articles that introduced me to those concepts. Although right now I don't have the time to make full pages of citations for these videos, if you ever would like to dive a little bit deeper into these concepts that I touch upon, feel free to ask me in the comments or shoot me an email and I would be happy to provide. Please do leave a comment sharing your thoughts on today's video. Which is your favorite animal in the lore? Mine is probably his dogs or wolves, but I myself am more of a rat person. Unfortunately, Tolkien didn't think to include you anywhere, did he? No, it's probably because you're too good for him. Right? Yeah. If you have any video ideas or requests, feel free to submit them via the Google form in my description. And huge thanks to those who have already submitted. There are a ton of great ideas in there and I can't wait to get into them. Please take a second to like this video if you enjoyed it. And if you had fun learning with me today, make sure that you hit the subscribe button as well as the notification bell so that you can stay up to date on every single video that I make. Thank you all so much for hanging out with me today, and I hope that you all have a very happy, hobbity day.